Hello everyone, I'm Ron Lemon and welcome back to Level Up with Lemonade, episode 4. In today's episode, we're going to finish the écorché by putting the muscles onto the skeleton. Many think that this is the most important step in learning anatomy. And while it is a very important part of the process, what's even more important is that you learn how to pose that figure in 3D space, which goes back to the armature video and just learning how to use the armature in general. By staging the figure with that armature, you'll have a better chance of creating a believable, more tangible pose that people can really connect with. We're going to begin with the axial skeleton, which is the head, the neck, the rib cage, and a part of the pelvis. We're going to put the muscles on front and back and understand how those are connected together. Then we're going to move on to the appendicular portion of the body, which is the limbs, from the shoulders to the fingers and from the hips to the toes. By breaking it up into these two sections, it makes it a lot easier to study the figure and study the functionality of those muscles. Later on in the episode, I'm going to do a few more student reviews. And again, thank you very much for those of you who are participating in this. I really appreciate your efforts. And in the last portion of the video, I'm going to take you out on location and teach you a few tricks and tips on how to draw people from real life, how to accomplish that goal, which seems sometimes really difficult, especially when people are moving about, but it really isn't that difficult as long as you follow the tips that I'm going to show you. Before we begin, I'd like to say thank you all once again for watching these videos. I truly appreciate it, and I really hope that you've learned something from them so far. Now, I know that videos can't teach you everything, but I appreciate you following along and taking the information in and sending me questions that have to do with your progress in your studies. Like, subscribe, share the video, and let's get into it. So the question here is, because there's so many layers of muscles on the body, where is a good place to start this whole process of adding anatomy and understanding those particular muscles? And I want to bring up a chart here. On this chart, we have two sections, a yellow section and a green section. On the yellow section, it's called the axial skeleton. That's the core. Now, keep in mind that core muscles are also attached to the pelvis, but a good majority of the pelvis is dedicated to the hips. The appendicular skeleton has to do with limbs, from the shoulders to the fingers, from the hips to the toes. The green in the skeleton might be a little deceiving because we need that to connect the abdominal wall and the obliques. However, this is just referring to the parts of the body and which muscles belong to which group. The place to start our musculature would be within the axial skeleton, understanding how to lay out the core of the body. And we're going to do that both in the front as well as in the back. Now, I've already taken the time to draw the skeleton and to draw the armature, because that would take an additional amount of time that I don't want to spend here, because we've already covered this in the first few videos. If you're not familiar with building the armature or the skeleton, please refer back to the last 2 previous videos in this Masterclass series. In this case, we're going to start with muscles that are on the front of the body. And to do that, I have set up layers over here. And I'm going to begin with the core section of the body, and I'm also going to zoom in a little bit. For the front of the body, we have just a few muscles that visibly affect how an artist would draw the human form. Keep in mind, the muscles that we're working with have to do with how an artist works with the human form. If we were to do this for medical purposes, there would be many more layers that we would be working with, but we're not going to concern ourselves with those other layers. We're going to worry more about what's on the surface or closest to the skin that affects the deformation of the skin. In fact, it affects how we draw somebody's body. The first one that we want to look at would be the muscles on the chest. These would be called the pectoralis muscles. The pectoralis muscle group is a group of striations. Each striation you could call a micromuscle, and there's a grouping of them. And all of these are bundled together to create one large shape. Now the shape goes across the clavicle, comes down along the sternum, moves out over towards the 5th and 6th rib. And there's a little change in direction here when we attach this to the 6th rib. And then this entire bundle comes over here and attaches to the outer edge of the humerus being the upper arm bone. The striations are as follows. We have the clavicular striation. Then we have the sternocostal striations. These striations are separated by the division of the ribs. Then we have the abdominal portion, which is going to attach to the abdominal wall. So we have these striations. Again, they attach to the lateral side of the arm, the humerus, about a third of the way down the length of the humerus. And this muscle group is for what you would call circumduction of the arm, which is to rotate the arm in a sort of circular motion around the body. That is what this particular muscle group's function is. So this is the first muscle that we would think about. The next muscle would be the abdominal wall, since we're going to be attaching this muscle to the abdominal wall. The abdominal wall comes down off of the 5th rib, drops down to the corner of the rib cage opening, drops down to the opening of the pelvis, is attached along the iliac crest, and then across the pubis, which is the very bottom of the pelvis. And I'll draw that same thing over on the other side. Now there are 2 layers to this. One layer is what you would call fascia. Fascia is like a hard, leathery material. And that sits on the outside of the abdominal wall. The muscles that we see and we're used to seeing, the 6-pack, which is actually an 8-pack because there are 4 sets of these muscles. This particular group of muscles is under the fascia layer. The fascia layer is what this muscle attaches to. So this muscle is not actually attached to the other muscles, it's attached to a layer that sits on top of those muscles. But we're going to look at those muscles because they make up the shape language that we see, especially on somebody who's really fit on the chest. There's a line that divides the 2 sides, but that line is actually a pretty healthy size. Then we also have an edge over here where the muscles are not connected. So this is fascia, this is fascia. Then the 4 sets of abdominal muscles are as follows. The upper set here, which in a way goes with the arch, but isn't necessarily following the arch. Then the second muscle is here, still within the ribcage shape or space. So we can go ahead and curve the lines on those muscles. And then I'm also going to put striations on them, which run vertically. Then we have the third set, which sits between the ribcage and the pelvis. And at the base of this third set is where the navel falls. The navel falls right around in here. And then the 4th set, which is the lower abdominal wall, down along here is the longest muscle head of the 4. This one is shaped in a way so that it sits in between the ribcage and pelvis and doesn't pinch awkwardly in the body, where this one is shaped with the ribcage. And if we were to do this with, there's a little trick that I learned from Another anatomy book that's escaping me right now, but you'll see that on screen. Joseph Peck. The last name is Peck. And he came up with this neat little trick to help us design these muscles, where if we find a little point, and this point varies from person to person, there's no set distance that this point is from the side of the body, but it's a marker. The lower ab runs horizontally over to that marker. The upper ab runs diagonally down towards that marker, and the space between the other two also runs over to that marker. So each of these is at a slightly different pitch than the previous set. This is for motion and movement purposes, to ease the motion within our torso. If they were all horizontal, there might be awkward pinching occurring, but because these all conform to the body, it makes it a lot easier for us to flex forward and flex and twist, because we have that kind of range of motion within the torso. So we have the abdominal wall, and we have the pectoralis muscles. And the last muscle that we would study for the front of the axial portion of the skeleton would be the oblique. The oblique runs along the side of the body over here and goes around the body to the back of the rib cage. The bottom of the oblique that starts at the top of the pelvis wraps around and attaches to the 12th rib. In fact, again, we have striations here within the obliques. Each of these striations comes down from the side of the body, wraps around the body, and then attaches to the abdominal wall. The bend in our body, like over here, occurs from each of these striations reaching back to a different rib. They're not attaching to the exact same place on the body. They're attaching further back and then closer to us as they go up the side of the body. So the bottom one, going back to the 12th rib, is going back like this. The next one is attaching to the 11th rib, and it's going back like this. The next one attaches to the 10th rib, and it's going back like this. And remember, that's going to the back of the body. In the drawing, it looks like it's going upward, but that's actually going to the back. Then the next one goes to the 9th rib, which is now on the rib cage side. And this is where it transitions from curving outward like this to curving outward in this direction. And then each following striation is going to do the same thing until it comes to the front of the body here. And the way that we would view those striations is through a stair-step system. Each one of them is going to stair-step from the previous. Each of these is its own striation. And then what connects in between each of those, for the last 3 ribs, it will be the latissimus muscle, which is on the back of the body. The rest of them are going to be what are called the serratus muscles that come from the inside edge of the scapula, wrap around the body, and curve through here, curve through here, curve through here. And we only see a few of these. The pectoralis muscle covers up the majority of them. There are 9 in total, which we will look at here shortly. But these are what interdigitate. The word is interdigitate. And these muscles interdigitate between each other along this little space here. Each of these different striations wraps around the body at a different distance. And because our pelvis is angled this way, the bottom few go directly to the back, where now as we move up, because the rib cage is sticking out, they start to push outward in this direction, and that's what forms the nice bend in the side of our body. These would be the muscles that we would start the torso with on the front of the body. Now we'll look at the muscles that are on the back of the core. Now we'll move on to the muscles that are on the back of the body. I went ahead and colored those in between sessions so that you didn't have to watch me do that. It's just using the marquee tool. and then filling the space in with color, which shouldn't take very long at all. And it is on its own layer. As I do these studies and as I have my students do these studies, I like to have everything separated on layers so that we can look at things through the layer system, not having everything all jam-packed into one layer. This is kind of a problem when we're working traditionally. If we don't have tracing paper to do multiple layers of the figure, then we end up creating a spider web effect. And after so many lines that are drawn on the page, it starts to get really confusing looking. And I don't really want any confusion here, especially since I'd like to be able to separate these out to share the information, not just in this demonstration, but for future purposes as well, being able to go into each layer and dig them apart as opposed to everything just being stuck together and we're sort of stuck with that. I'd like to be able to share the skeleton separate from the muscles, separate from the armature, and so forth. And when I'm doing any kind of review with my student work, I want the students to separate each of these out into separate drawings. So one would be the armature. One would be the armature with the skeleton. The next one would be the armature, skeleton, and the muscles. And it makes it a lot easier for me to walk them back through all the steps that they're taking to find where the missing link or the broken part is within the process. It makes it a lot easier to identify where the problem is or any kind of problem that might be occurring is so that we can pinpoint it specifically. Because again, if everything is drawn together in one mass, it's really difficult to separate those layers from one another to pinpoint that inaccuracy and or to be able to explain why something wasn't working very well. Now on the back of the body, we have two layers of muscles. We have the intrinsic muscles or the deep muscles, and then we have the superficial muscles. Those are the ones that are directly below the skin. Now with the intrinsic muscles, we want to begin with, let me get up to the back portion here. We want to start with the innermost muscle, which would be the erector spinae group. And that is a large oval that comes down like this and goes back up like this and goes across like this, right? But I'm only going to work on one side here. And then I'll put the surface muscles over on this side. Now, this is a bundle or a series of bundles. We have one bundle here. We have a second one here, and we have a third one here. Consider this group of muscles the abdominal wall of the back. It's also what we see through the latissimus and the trapezius muscles, which are the topmost muscles. Now, a quick and easy artistic way to do this would be to draw what looks like a stretched out tire, a bicycle tire, or a stretched out donut shape. That opening or the more obvious space between the two muscle groups, the left side and the right side, would be within the middle of the back to the tailbone. Along in here, there's more of a hollow space than we're going to find up here simply because there's 3 layers of muscles up here that overlap one another. We don't need to draw each of the bundles, but what we need to remember is to make this as wide as possible and allow it to go under the scapulas because, again, this is the abdominal wall of our body in the back. I'm going to put a few curves on it to show the kind of shape language that we would see this as. It would be large curves that are showing through both the trapezius and the latissimus. So this is the erector spinae. And again, this muscle is holding us up, where the abdominal muscle is the flexing muscle of the front of the body. That's how we lean forward. The obliques are twisting muscles. They help us with the twisting motion of the body. This is going to hold us upright as we're sitting, as we're standing. When you get a sore back, it's usually this muscle group that's causing that soreness to occur. Now, sitting over the top of this, up near the top, is the rhomboid muscle. This muscle comes from the edge of the scapula along in here. It goes from the C7 to the T5. The T5 would be your thoracic vertebrae. And so the T5 and the C7. And it's called a rhomboid because of its geometric shape. And it also has striations. Each striation goes to a separate vertebrae. And this muscle is partly responsible for shrugging your shoulders against each other or towards one another towards the spine. And this would be the second most muscle on the back in the stack of muscles, and partly why you don't see the split along the spine, because it is welded towards the spinua processes, which are the little bumps that stick out on all of our vertebrae. And then sitting over the top of that is the trapezius muscle. So this upper half really gets stacked and covers up any indication of a space between along the spine. Where down here, we don't have as many muscles overlapping one another, so it becomes more obvious and much more visible within that space. Okay, so those are deeper muscles. Now, sitting on top of that, we have two more muscles to look at. We have the largest muscle on our body, which is the latissimus dorsi. That goes across the rib cage. It's attached to the spine. It goes across the rib cage and inserts on the upper third of the arm. Now, you might say, but doesn't this muscle insert on the upper third of the arm? And yes, it does, but they stack in a different kind of order. This muscle is going to be attaching right here, where this muscle is attaching laterally on the arm. So they are in different locations. They are layered over each other, but they're also on a different axis of the humerus bone. This then comes down and connects to the ribs 9, 10, 11, and 12. Actually, no, let me take that back. It attaches to 10, 11, and 12 on the rib cage, the last 3 ribs. Crosses over the negative space and is also anchored to the tailbone. And then again, all along here, it's anchored next to the spinua processes. Along the spine, this is tendinous, down along through here. This is tendinous here, going to the front of the arm. And then we have striations again on this muscle. Each one of these striations lands on each or between each vertebrae set. And then the last insertion point is right back here on our tailpipes that sit next to the tailbone. That's the last point where this muscle is attached. And is a large, flat muscle with the exception of the side over here. That side is going to bundle up and have more mass to it. When we work out, it's the sides over here that end up enlarging as far as building a swollen looking muscle like the bicep can look. That's going to be the area where this muscle increases in its mass. The rest of the back is more like a sheet that sits over the top of all the other muscles, and it's these deeper muscles that define the shape of our back through that particular sheet. Now, the last muscle that we put on here in this large stack of muscles is called the trapezius muscle. It also, from the Peck book, has a kite-like appearance to it. If you've ever flown a kite before, it has that kind of an appearance to it. Although I would say differently, I would actually call it more dagger-like, because it has like a little handle, a hilt, and a blade looking shape to it. That's my particular analogy of what the muscle might look like. It's going to attach up here as a column. It's then going to come down and connect to the scapula here. Then it's going to reach out over to the acromion process and connect along the front third here of the clavicle. And I'll go ahead and draw that over on this side. This goes out and over to the neck and then turns and goes up this way. All of this space next to it is a hollowed out space. It does not have muscle filled within it. Then this comes down along the acromion process. It terminates at the end of the acromion process, and then under the acromion process, there is a small portion of fascia that's attached to the underside. And that is a corner over here So it slides on the scapula. And then the muscle fibers begin from here down to the base of the rib cage. So we have this kind of a shape. Down at the base of the rib cage, remember this attaches to the very bottom of our rib cage. Down at the base of the rib cage, this is fascia here. Here is our C7, and there's a diamond of fascia that sits around that particular bone. And then the rest of this is striations. Striations out this way towards the spine, and then they invert and go upwards this way. This is a little bit messy in here. We have fibers that are crossing this way, and then we also have fibers that are going up along in here. Now, what I do in this particular section is draw these curved lines around to show the column-like shape, as well over here, curved lines to show the curve that goes up and over from the back to the front of the body, and then everything else I build as striations so we can see the muscle flaring out. So for the back of the body, we have these 4 muscles that define all of the shapes of our back. Where again, on the front of the body, we have these 3 shapes that define the front, with the exception of the trapezius up here that sort of fills in the neck space. But because that's coming from the back, we don't attribute it to the front. Now, the trapezius muscle is responsible for moving the scapula. This muscle, the latissimus, is responsible for bringing the arm back towards the body, which is called adduction. Abduction, with a B, is to separate from the body, where adduction, with a D, is to bring together. And that's what this particular muscle does. And the rhomboid is also responsible for moving the scapula. So as far as the core of the body goes, these are the more important muscles. Now, one other place I want to look really quickly while we're here is at the face, the skull, because this is also part of the axial skeleton, as well the neck. And the neck in the front, the only muscle that we're absolutely concerned with would be what is called the sternocleidomastoideus muscle. And it attaches to both the sternum and the clavicle over here. There's 2 muscles that overlap one another. This goes up towards the ear and attaches to these bumps right here on the back of the skull, or behind the ear, comes down and creates a V-like shape in the neck. Tendon through here, muscle head through here. So the muscle is kind of shaped like this. Curved through here. Then the second muscle comes down kind of like a strap, a belt strap. And this is the one that attaches to the clavicle right over here. So this comes up this way. This comes up this way and forms the sternocleidomastoideus muscle. Then we have the throat and the column of the throat. And there's other small muscles within this space, but they aren't as defining as this particular muscle is right here. So I'm not going to spend much time on that. Now, if you were to take one of my anatomy classes, we would definitely be covering these muscles. But in short here, I don't want to spend all this time looking at every little tiny nuance. I'm more concerned with the big impressionable muscles that we would be mostly using when we do our illustrations. The throat comes forward. So the head is like this, and the throat comes forward this way, while the sternocleidomastoideus muscle goes this way. They sort of oppose one another in their angular direction. Now, the big muscles that we would need to concern ourselves with on the skull. We have the occipital frontalis muscles, and there's 2 of them on either side of our forehead, over here and then over here. But again, I'm only going to cover just one side of the body. Then below that, surrounding the eyeball, is called the orbicularis oculi. There's several little striations in here. Kind of think of it like 2 corners like this, and we have striations above and we have striations below that help roll the eye within the eye socket. We have the corrugator supercilii, and that's a small muscle right here. And that's responsible for wiggling our eyebrow. So we have the orbicular here, We have the corrugator here, and we have the frontalis here. I'm going to put some striations on this one. If I put striations on the other one, it's just going to make everything look really messy. And this muscle actually is not just within the eye. It also attaches surrounding the eye socket, around the outer edges. It's not just a within the eye socket type of muscle. Then we have a series of muscles that come from our cheek along here. We have the zygomaticus minor. We have the zygomaticus major. The zygomaticus minor attaches to a circular muscle that goes around the mouth, just like going around the eyeball. And this is called the orbicularis oris. And it terminates above and below the lips. So the lips sit inside of here, and this muscle curves up and around. And do keep in mind that also these muscles do have a central core where there's a left side and a right side down the center line of the body. We have another muscle that runs along the side of the nose here. And this one I have a hard time with. It's the levator labii supercilius alaque nasi. And I know I butchered a few of those words. I just call it the muscle that surrounds the nose. I don't get too lost in that one. And then over the top of the nose, we have what's called the nasalis. And these are responsible for lifting the corners of the nostrils, flaring the nostrils. Underneath here, within this space, we have the levator labii superioris that sits under here, and then right next to that, the levator anguli oris. And it's another one that I'm not going to really be able to draw in there because it's now starting to get really crowded. But if you think about the mouth, there's muscles that surround it like this over here. There's muscles that surround it like this over here, which are responsible for the movement and the motion of the mouth. We have the risorius, and let me just draw these two circles on either side of the mouth. These are called lobes. And we have a bunch of muscles that attach to each of those, and those are responsible for lifting the corners of the mouth, giving us our expressions. One of these muscles that goes back to the jaw is called the risorius. Then down below that, we have the depressor angularis, which is down along in here. Then in the very back, over on the jaw, which I'll do over here, we have the masseter muscle, and that fits along in here under the zygomatic arch and attaches to the bottom of the jaw. And that's what shapes the corners of our jaw. Some big, large, muscular person is going to have big, giant corners on the jaw, where the rest of us, it's not going to look like there's a muscle sitting there. It's just going to look like the jawbone. But trust that there is a muscle there, and that helps open and close the jaw. Then we have the depressor muscle, which is here attached to the orbicularis oris. And then we have another muscle here that's attached to the bottom of the chin called the mentalis. These are the majority of muscles that sit on the front of the face that define our face. Oh, and then we have another one that sits in between here. This is called the glabella in the bone section, but this is called the procerus muscle that sits in between. And this is also responsible for moving the eyebrow up and down, inward, kind of like if we have a scowl on our face, that muscle is at work. Then we have the temporalis muscles, which sit on the sides of the head over here. Now this muscle also has a small one in the very back in here. And interestingly, between the front and the back of these muscles, this is the occipital frontalis occipital belly, where this is the frontal belly. And when we lift our eyebrows up, this pulls upward, but it's this muscle that's actually pulling everything up. Then when we scowl, this muscle is at work, and this one isn't, and it pulls everything back in the other direction. So it's sort of like a teeter-totter balancing both the front and the back of the head. All of these make up the axial skeletal portion of our body. The head and the head muscles, the neck muscles, and the torso muscles. Do keep in mind that there is a second layer of muscles that sits on the front, but does not distort the skin in the same way that these do. And then on the back, there's definitely another set of muscles that sit even deeper underneath all of these. But one more time, if it doesn't affect what we draw as an artist, there's really no need for us to study it unless you just like that kind of information. There's nothing wrong with that. But as far as art goes, those other muscles are not going to affect what we draw. Now we're going to look at the appendicular portion of the body, which would be from the shoulders to the fingertips and from the hips to the toes. Moving on to the legs now, this is where things get a little bit messy. And I want to start this by first saying that when you block in muscles, when you're in an anatomy class, it's a good idea to separate them out one muscle at a time. But when you're drawing muscles for the sake of illustration purposes, it might be a better idea to start with the basic shapes. Some of the basic shapes might be like with this muscle up here, the pectoralis. I've sort of jokingly explained to my students, like if you were to draw a cartoon fish, that might be the better way to quickly lay in the muscle. That way you're not getting caught up in the striations. With the legs, I would say that the lower half of the leg might be good to start with a bowling pin shape, a juggling club shape, or a chicken leg shape, right? Any of those might be good as a starting point, and then from there, divide, 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 and so forth, which also means when you're dividing it up into the smaller striations of muscles, that there will be some deformation taking place. The initial shape that we draw is a basic shorthand for all the stuff that goes in that space. On the top of the leg, it's a large teardrop and then a triangle on the inside of the leg. That's the kind way of putting the shapes together. And remember the previous video, how I mentioned that when we divide each segment, the upper and the lower of the arms and the legs, we would then also divide each of those segments into thirds, where the bulk of the muscle starts in the upper third. Then it tapers through the middle third. Then it becomes more tendinous in the lower third. And that's exactly how each of these sections will play out. It will go from a bulkier to a tapered to a thinner segment. Now, there are exceptions, like the vastus medialis that sits on the inside in here sticks out a little bit farther through here, and that disrupts that idea of wider to narrower. But that's a small, minor change. The lower leg is exactly this way. We have the bulk of the muscles sitting up in here, we have them tapering through here, and then it becomes tendon and bone in the lower half. The arm is the same way. The forearm has a bulk, taper, tendon kind of appearance to the muscles, while the upper half of the arm has bulk through here, tapers a little bit, and then bulks up again right here because of the ridge muscles or the supination muscles that rotate your hand palm down or palm upward. Like I said, there's some exceptions to these rules, but if we think about them with this kind of generalization, it makes it much easier for us to articulate the body with a little more clarity than to just try to put a whole bunch of muscles on, making the figure look deformed, like the Michelin Man or bib, or anything else that feels very out of context to the human being. The other word that I want to describe here really quickly, or words that I want to describe here for the muscles. Muscles have their head. Then they have their tendon. At the head portion, we would call this the origin. This is where the muscle originates from. At the tendinous end, we are going to call this the insertion. So origin and insertion is how we design the muscles. I feel that it's important that if you don't know the shape of the muscle very well, draw the entire tendon first so you can see where it's coming from and where it's going to, and then add the muscle head to that tendon, right? So the tendon is all through here. It's like a sharp rope. But then the muscle itself bulks up around that, and then we cut it off at a certain point so that it becomes two separate pieces. But the tendon still gives us a straight line of information. Every muscle flexes or extends. Doesn't do anything else. It doesn't curve like a banana. It doesn't deform. It flexes or it extends. It's like a robot part. And that straight line is really important because that is the insertion and the origin, and that pulley-like effect or piston-like effect of the muscle shrinking or extending from those particular points on the body. Muscles on the legs and on the arms. Starting at the pelvis, the muscles will attach to the upper leg. On the upper leg, the muscles will attach to the lower leg. On the lower leg, the muscles will attach to the foot. And then we have muscles that sit within the feet called intrinsic muscles. Those stay within the feet themselves. Though on the front of the body, we have an angle that comes down like this, full of muscles along in here. Then we have the large teardrop shape that comes down through here. And also that extends off to the side over here on the side of the body. So it's not just in the front, but it also curves over to the side. The front muscle here is called the quadricep muscle. The muscles in here are called the adductors. Those bring the legs together. Where this muscle, the quadricep, is like the tricep of the arm. It is the extension muscle. And then on the back of the leg, we have the bicep that sits along in here, made up of two sets of muscles that bulk when we lift the lower half of our leg up in this particular direction. It's flexing the lower leg into the upper leg. So these are shapes to think about. Now, there's also these barrier muscles. We have one that comes from the top of the iliac crest. So now I'm going to add a couple bones to the iliac crest really quickly that we haven't discussed in the previous video, the skeleton video. There's a bump right here, and there's a bump right here, two of them. And these are origin points for our muscles. The anterior superior iliac spine, the anterior inferior iliac spine. Both of these bumps, again, are for the muscles that are in the front of the body. We have the tensor fascia lata that comes off here, which is one of the hip muscles. Then we have the sartorius that comes down through here that divides the quadricep from the adductor muscles. Now, starting with the hips, we'll just focus on the hips for this round. There are three muscles that we would want to look at. The first muscle would be the gluteus maximus, and that goes along the tailbone, comes down through here, and then swings out and attaches to what is called the iliotibial tract. This is not a muscle, this is a tendon that it's going to attach to, and I don't have the tendon drawn yet, but what I'll do is I'll draw the barrier along here and where it aims towards that iliotibial tract. Comes up and also inserts to the great trochanter on the leg. This comes down like so, and this entire space is muscle. Now I'm going to remove those striations and I'm going to give it art striations so we can kind of see the roundness of the muscle. Sitting next to that is the gluteus medius. This runs along here, which you can't see because I'm drawing underneath the oblique, which I added after we were done with the previous set of muscles. I made sure to add it so that we can see that on the torso from the back view. But along this plate, all along in here, coming down and attaching to the top of the great trochanter is the gluteus medius. So through here and attaching here. Then on the front of the body, we have another muscle called the tensor fascia lata, and it's a teardrop-like muscle that has 3 states to it. Standing, it's like this. With the leg pulled back behind the body this way, it becomes more like this. Although we're still going to have a tapering effect happening up here, it's more belt-like when it stretches. And then when we sit down, it squeezes up like this and turns into what looks like a Hershey's Kiss. It has more of or a candy corn. It has a kind of a bulky shape to the bottom of it. And that's with the muscle flexing. So in this case, we're just going to see the curve coming down like so. This also attaches to the side of the greater trochanter, and then it too attaches to the iliotibial tract. Now, iliotibial is a band that comes down from the great trochanter, and actually it starts up along the top of the iliac crest, along here. Comes down, covers the great trochanter, becomes a strap as it goes down the side of the leg, and then eventually terminates on the tibia in the very front, like right around here. So from the front view, it would come down like so. And we might see a hint of it in terms of its width. It's a lot easier to see this muscle from the side view of the body as opposed to the front view of the body. Those 3 muscles make up what you would call the shoulder for the legs, right? These are the shoulder muscles for our legs. So the gluteus medius, the gluteus maximus, this bigger one here, and the tensor fascia lata. Those 3 make up the hip. Now the tensor fascia is attached to this bump right here. Comes down like so, connects to the great trochanter, and terminates on the iliotibial tract. Then everything else that's in the front of the body through here belongs to the adductor group, which is going to be that triangle that sits on the inside of the leg. I'm going to clean this up over here just so the muscles are a little bit easier to recognize in their silhouettes. These 3 muscles make up what you would call the shoulder for the leg. It's the hip, but it's the same thing as the deltoid muscle here that's made up of 3 different heads that surround the corner of the shoulder. These surround the corner of the leg and then attach down here to the lower half of the leg. The next section I want to look at here is the shoulder muscles. Now, the shoulder muscles, there are a few that extend from the shoulder to the torso, and then there are several that we call intrinsic, which means within the shape. Because it's a scapula, because it's a separate bone from the rest of the body, these muscles on the inside help regulate the movement of the arm, while the muscles that attach to the scapula move the scapula. So you have 2 different sets of muscles within the shoulder that operate the arm and the shoulder movement together. So the first one that I want to look at here would be the serratus muscles. Now this is a really difficult one to even bother drawing at all because it goes from this edge along here of the scapula and it wraps around to the front along here on the front of the rib cage, much like the oblique, which is a difficult muscle also to describe because it goes from the front of the body to the back of the body. It's not easy to chart. What I'm going to do is create a quick and simple shorthand here on the front of the body to kind of show you what it does. So along the edge of the scapula, the inside edge on the underside, there are 9 muscles that are attached along this edge. Each of these muscles is like kind of like a sausage type of shape that attaches from rib number 1 down to rib number 9. Remember that the bottom rib on the rib cage is rib number 10. So the serratus muscles actually terminate somewhere right around here. Now notice how low the pectoralis muscle goes, which means what we're going to visibly see then are roughly 3 muscles of this particular muscle group. And if our pectoralis muscle is narrow rather than tall, we might see 4 of those striations, but likely we're going to see 3. Now on the internet, I've seen people do this kind of weird, like 3-fingered hand type of shape, which doesn't make any sense to me to even learn it that way, because you're not actually learning the muscles. You're learning a shorthand, which kind of helps you get a drawing done really quickly. But if you're really in this to learn how to do your drawings correctly, you want to know how this whole thing works. And then you develop your own personal shorthand for getting things correct. Now, one thing that I also want to say about this muscle is that they are not parallel like this to one another. They radiate like this. So each one of them should aim in a very specific direction, different from the other muscles. So looking at it up here, we have those muscles kind of doing something like this. They come down the side of the body, and each one of these points in a different direction. They're not all aiming towards the same point. And again, they're not parallel to one another. I'm going to get rid of all of those little lines. Come back over here, and we'll draw a few of them visible to the eye. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The 9th one to the 9th rib. The 8th one to the 8th rib. 7th to the 7th rib. 6th to the 6th rib. 5 to the 5th. 4, 3, 2, and then 1, like so. Now all of this stuff that's within the scapula we're not going to bother with. It's what's external to that over off to the side that we're more concerned with. I'm going to turn this into a cylinder form or a tube-like shape. Then I'm going to do the same with this one. And the same with this one. Then this one. Those are the only serratus muscles we can visibly see from this view, and that's all we have to concern ourselves with. As long as they terminate here against the scapula, we're good to go. From the front of the body, I'll draw this one, interdigitating, then this one, and then finally the last one, and the latissimus would sit right along here. Now that's another thing that I want to make mention of. The muscles on the side of the body, the side of the rib cage like so, these terminate long before it gets to the front of the torso. The latissimus comes up from the back, attaches to the arm, and covers up a good majority of these muscles. Now if the arm goes forward and the shoulder comes forward, this muscle also comes forward and covers up more of the muscles. Think of the latissimus muscle like a blanket, and it can be drawn over these muscles more if the arms are out extended in front of the body. If we draw our arms back behind our body, it'll expose those muscles further. So you'll see more, a little bit, or less, depending upon the angle of the arm. But do keep that in mind, because as I've seen with comic book artists, they try to shove every muscle in every view, and it really doesn't work that way. You have to be very specific to the action that the body is taking, or you will misunderstand what you're designing, and misinterpret it just enough to where it then becomes really noisy and busy and it doesn't feel realistic anymore. When people say that the drawings look stiff, this is one of the reasons, is we stiffen the muscles up by trying to build a muscle chart in every picture, and it really doesn't work that way. You have to be mindful of the action, and that will help dictate which muscles are most visible and which muscles sort of get hidden because of the action. Now, moving on to the intrinsic muscles, we have 4 of them that sit on the inside of the scapula. One of them along in here that goes underneath the acromion process and is slightly curved. And this is called the supraspinatus. Supra means above. So above then is kind of like this. There's an axis line right along here, and then the ball joint. Supra is above this axis line. Infra is below, and that's the next one that we put in, the infraspinatus. And that fills a good majority of the scapula right along in here. Both of these muscles attach to the ball joint of the humerus. The supraspinatus helps elevate the arm and lift it up in this particular direction. The infraspinatus helps pull the arm back behind the body. If you are going to be tied with both your hands tied together, the infraspinatus is at work. Then we have 2 more muscles that sit in this particular space. We have the teres minor, which sits here, kind of a cigar shape, and it also attaches to the ball joint. Then we have the teres major, and it attaches to the front of the humerus and stretches out a little bit farther. So we have teres major, teres minor, infraspinatus, supraspinatus, serratus muscles, and then sitting over the top, and also between these 2 muscles right here and here, they help us, this is a top section of the body, they help us roll the shoulder forward like this, or roll the shoulder back like this. So they are responsible for helping us roll our arm. And rolling it means that the hand is going to twist from palm forward to palm back, as well as the shoulder moving forward, like we're shrugging our shoulders forward, and we're shrugging our shoulders back behind us. Then we have the deltoid muscle, which I'll draw over here and over here. The deltoid connects to the inner curve here, in line with the trapezius. The clavicle has that bicycle handlebar shape. Trapezius attaches here, deltoid attaches here, at that axis point where the bicycle handlebar changes direction. Comes down, sits over the bicep, and attaches to this bump right here, which is not a bump in reality. The arm bone has like a long gradual curve like this, and it's at the apex of that curve that we would draw the deltoid. But for sake of drawing, we create wheels to show the clavicles roll on the manubrium, and we create targets to aim the muscles to so that we have deliberate points on the body for the muscles to attach to. Now there are 3 heads of the deltoid. There's the anterior, there is the lateral, and then there is the posterior. I'm going to do this on the back side here. So the back side is shaped very similarly to the front side. It starts at the end of the acromion process, and this is all underneath the trapezius muscle. The actual head, the posterior head, attaches next to the trapezius, and everything that's along in here is tendon that attaches underneath. And these tendons have a sheath that sits over the top of them, because if our muscles touched each other or our bones touched each other, you would feel the most excruciating pain from an electric shock. So where the body has more mobility, the muscles have a covering over them to protect them from rubbing against other muscles. So this entire space along in here is one of those tendinous portions. And we draw this outward slightly and then attach to that midpoint. Now, you might think that the deltoid is smaller, and for some people it might look smaller because they spend a lot of time building up their biceps and brachialis muscle, and even the tricep. But the deltoid does attach halfway down the humerus. From this view, we're going to see the lateral and the posterior head. And from this view, we're going to see the anterior and the lateral head. And from the back view, the acromion process goes downward towards the back. From the front view, we only see the very end of the acromion process. We don't see the rest of it because it's angled downward. And then finally over here, the deltoid goes across all of these muscles and attaches here, like so. And from the back, as you can see here, there's a small space where these two muscles are visible. The rest of the muscles are buried under the body of these larger muscles. The deltoid covers, the latissimus covers, and the trapezius covers the majority of those intrinsic muscles. Now on the front, the curve of the pectoralis right along in here, I'll extend this out a little bit farther. The curve of the pectoralis and the deltoid meet each other along this barrier line. And there's a small triangle right up in here that visibly separates the pectoralis from the deltoid. Most of us have that visible on our own body. But the way that these muscles are seen separated from one another would be from the top view. The pectoralis comes down this way, and then the deltoid comes out this way. So there's a visible separation between the striations of each of these muscles. But if you notice, they all fit nicely together. It's like a perfect puzzle. They all slip into a nice organization, and all of the striations go down along this way and then become this. It's like a funnel of striations. And that's also the same with the side muscles. They funnel down into the striations of the front of the body. So there's this beautiful harmony amongst all of the muscles in terms of their striations. When we're first learning how to do anatomy, though, we don't see anything like that. We're so caught up in one muscle versus the next that we can't see the patterns. But eventually, when you learn the muscles, you will start to see that there's a really nice organization that takes place to keep all of these muscles in order. And this is the difference between somebody studying anatomy versus somebody drawing the human form. The muscles flow together rhythmically through action. Where when we're studying, it really doesn't matter in the beginning because we just need to connect a shape to a name to a location, which is part of the reason why anatomy can be difficult to study. There's a good number of things that we have to attribute these muscles to long before we completely understand them. When you're looking at books like How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way, it doesn't organize the muscles. It teaches you muscles in bubble form. And I do believe that there's several manga books that teach you how to do manga drawing that also show muscles in this same light, which is really unfortunate because that's not how muscles work, but we end up with this lumpy, bumpy kind of approach. And then if we're smart enough and we go, hey, I want to take an anatomy class, we take that class and it has nothing to do with what we've learned prior in those books, we get a little turned off from that because things seem so different. How could they be different when I bought a book on how to do this, but it's not like the anatomy that I'm learning now? And that's the difficulty, because when we first like drawing, we're usually younger and we like drawing our favorite cartoons or comics. and we buy things that are attributed to cartoons and comics. The industry understands this, and they sell books for all ages. So you could kind of think of it like a primer book. But if you really want to delve into it, then you have to learn the subject and you have to really understand it, which means part of us needs to purge previous information, and then we have to take in all this new information, and that can wear on us a little bit. So I understand the frustration of learning anatomy. I definitely had it myself because I followed along with the How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way long ago, and then everything switched once I took an anatomy class. But believe me, if you can stick with it and you can practice this enough, you are going to gain incredible insight into how to build the body. And then from there, it's nothing but rhythm and flow, because at least you now know how the body works. All right, now we're going to look at some student work. And again, thank you all for participating. I really appreciate this, and I hope you appreciate the critiques. Welcome back to our student review, and I have a lot of them here, so let's go ahead and jump right into it. I'll start with this first one here. So my request this week was to bring in images that follow the last video's process, going from the armature to the armature and the skeleton fitting within it. So I do appreciate those of you who were able to follow along with that. I also have a few here to review that don't have the skeletons involved. Hopefully it's okay to review these since they were posted. So on this page, a few things I'm going to point out. We're chasing the bone structure too much in here. There's too many corners. The pillow is really simply just a pillow shape. There's no need for chasing anatomy at this point. Oops, that's too far. We'll rotate it around to here. And the center line is too far over this way. It should be closer to this side of the body. The skeleton, the one problem is that the bones on the back here are filled in too much. The back of that bone goes something like this. The length of the bone is towards the front, not the whole bone. So that is a little bit off. And then the ball joint here is too low. That should be directly in the center of this plane. And the forearm is rotated in the wrong position. This should have the X shape to it, like this, since the hand is pronated. And then the ankles are attached to the heel when they should be attached to the arch, directly above the arch. So that's also a little off. This bone goes directly underneath this section of the bone, but this section of the bone is also too small and should be larger. Between these two, they should both make this before trying to find the circular points, which actually fill in this entire space at length. And then the shaft of the bone is towards the front. And that's the same with this one. The shaft of the bone is towards the front. The fibula is directly linked to the underside of this bone. The spine needs to bend all the way through here. This needs to bend through here. This is too straight. This is too straight all the way through. The back never is never straight. It'll never be straight. So the same with this one. This gap is far too large. This is too large here. And then this doesn't rotate or bend with the back. There should also be a curve in here. And then the skull is a little strange because we're chasing features and then chasing shapes. We should make the whole thing one simple thing to begin with. This looks pretty good right here. These are bent in the wrong direction. They should both be curved this way. Head is too small. Limbs are too long, especially the lower limbs. The lower limbs are never longer than the upper limbs, either on the arms or on the legs. They're always going to be shorter. Remember the golden rule thing. Upper limb, take 2/3 of that. Lower limb, take 2/3 of that extremity. So it's always going to have a step down. And then the feet over here are not drawn through, and we're looking for too much information again too soon. We don't need arches. We just need a very simple shape like this. Doubled up, of course. Narrow at the ankle, narrow at the heel, wider at the toes. You can start with a box and then shave away at the heel, or start with a box and add for the toes. All right, a problem here. We have a little tiny piece of paper and we're trying to fit a whole bunch of drawings into that little paper. We really need to just like do 1 or 2 figures per page and try to make them the exact height of the page. The more space you have, the easier it is to solve the problem. The smaller they get, the more you have to cram little tiny things into little tiny things, and it just makes for a big dexterity issue, especially when we're first learning how to draw the figure. We want as large a drawing as possible so we have enough room to draw everything out thoroughly. When the drawing gets too small, then we're doing micro drawings, and it doesn't really make any sense to practice doing that. The extremities on a lot of these are far too small. We usually have this fear of drawing hands and feet, so we either put them in minimally or we leave them out. And I would recommend that you draw everything with the same kind of courage. Don't try to chase something or substitute it with something else. And be more thorough with the finger shape. You want to make sure, even when the hand is closed, that you give everything a good solid volume so you can see the entire block draw through, but also you can see the scale of the shapes very easily. And then the lines on all of these should be bent in flexion direction, all of them, regardless of what you see. When the leg is long, draw 2 lines all the way through. Don't bother chasing each half. Try to be very thorough with the whole thing. This is sort of diving 2 shapes into each other. We want to just go straight through on those. The balance is off on this one, and the body is falling over. This one, head is too big, legs are too small. Torso is, mid-size, but the legs and the head both are out of scale to the torso. But awesome job also with the floor planes. I believe this is from one of the sessions that the students have over on our Discord channel. So I may also be critiquing this out of context because these are quick sketches, but do keep in mind, the shorter the amount of time, the more absolute you want each of your lines to be. Look and think about what line you're going to draw. Look at it again, draw once. Look 3 times, draw once is a really good process to think through or think like when you're building your drawings. Same problem here. We have too many figures on a page that's too small. There's not enough room to actually make sense of the drawings. Awesome job with the floor planes. That's really nice. And the feet and the hands are a little bit too small on most of these, but at least they are on the body, which is great that we're drawing them in. The feet should have a draw through to them. Remember, you want to draw the foot on the floor before you draw the foot rising from the floor. Make sure that that foot is squarely on the floor plane, which is the reason why you draw the floor plane, to make sure that you capture the body in perspective correctly. Head is too small, limbs are too large, head is too big for that body. And this is a little strange. We have something that's extending past the legs. It's going to be somewhere up around here, flush with the body. We don't have the reference here, so it's a little hard to make sense of what's going on there. Legs are too small, upper body is very large. So there's a disproportionate relationship between the upper and the lower half. All right, so in this one, the curve back here should extend and curve through here. We won't have a straight spine anywhere. Curve through here, curve through here, curve through here. The space between here is too large and this curve is too radical. He's not arched back like this. He's just leaned back. He's falling back in space, but his body doesn't have this kind of a relationship between the upper and the lower half. The shoulders are coming forward, but the body is basically straight back like this. Draw through on that foot. And let's see, kneecap should be much larger here. The kneecap should have just as much dimension as the rest of the body. Remember to do a draw through on all the small shapes, just as much as you do a draw through on the large shapes. Armatures look really good. These are pretty solid. The skeletons overall look really good. These shoulders might be sticking out a little too far, and we also don't have them drawn correctly yet. the entire top half is missing. The acromion process and this triangle also need to be added to those. And clavicles don't rest against the ball joint at all. There's a space between. The clavicle attaches to the scapula, but the upper half of the scapula is missing on all of these, so that does make it hard. And you're missing the ulna bone overlapping the humerus. Remember that the humerus and the ulna bone are interlocking at this joint. And then the radius bone, the bottom of that bone, there's a notch in here for the ulna bone to connect into, and there's a bump that sticks out here for the radius bone to rotate over. I feel a little bad looking at these and critiquing them because these are also coming from the quick sketch session, but there's some things I want to point out. The hands and feet are really small, and the hands don't really connect to the arm at all. We have an arm cylinder, and then we have a hand that looks paper thin, sort of like an add-on. The arm cylinder comes down, and then the hand block is a volume that attaches to the wrist. We end up squaring off this end of the wrist, and then the rest of the arm stays cylindrical. We're chasing muscles instead of chasing the skeletal section with more of a flexion line in them. Remember that everything should have flexion. Legs are drawn under the pillow instead of within the pillow. Remember, we want to draw an ellipse into the pillow to connect the leg within the body shape. Legs are not under the body when we're sitting forward. Legs are within the pillow shape through here. Remember that the muscles of the leg comes from the pelvis, so we're a little bit off in terms of the relocation of those legs. And this is great. Anytime you can, it's always good to go back over your own work and try to make corrections to them. I think that's fantastic. This is overdone. He's leaned back through here and his head leans back, but the curvature here is sort of has too much torsion to it. It's rotated back just a little bit too far. Nice. Floor planes look awesome on these. Armatures are chasing the muscles still. And these curves, we don't want the curves to be going in this particular direction. We want everything to be curving in this direction. So this, and then a little bit more on the straight side for the lower half. This is too large. It should be half the width. So we want the pelvis to be narrower, not wide through here like so. This is too far forward or too straight forward. Remember that there's a tilt in both the rib cage and the pelvis. Rib cage is going to be tilted back like this, and the pelvis is going to be tilted forward this way. The pelvis is tilted forward more. The body comes through here. The body comes through here, filling in the rest of the space. Tailbone goes back like this. Pubis goes forward like this. This curve it needs to sit between the rib cage and the pelvis. It doesn't want to start curving into the rib cage. The rib cage has its own curve. This has its own curve, and the neck has its own curve coming forward. And then again, we're chasing muscles instead of the width of the skeleton. And that's making these bones far too large for the body. You have the ankle attached to the heel where it should be attached to the top of the arch. And that's the same with both of these. It's in the wrong position. But overall, I think, again, this is a really good attempt. So far, everybody's attempts are really good on these. On this one, we have too much of a straight spine. There should be a curve here and a curve here. There should be a curve here and a curve here, just like this curve, but this is attached to the back of the head instead of directly behind the jaw. And that's the same with this one. Too far back where it should be right behind the jaw. We have the ankle in the correct position. The heels might be a little on the large side overall, but it looks really good. You've done a really nice job with these. The bones look good. The connection of the bones look really good. The hands, try to make sure that you find the wrist bones and then divide this into the four metacarpals. Oh, sorry, the four carpal bones. Curve here, curve here, curve here, right behind the jaw. Yeah, nice job with these. Overall, these are really good. There's small errors in them, but small errors are easily correctable. And overall, you did a great job with those. See, this is the right size figure for these pages. This is great. Horizon lines are a little too high. Her horizon line is down along through here in the thighs. So these floor planes are too extreme, where this you can see is very shallow. Feet are too small, feet are too small, feet are too small. Overall, they need to be larger. These legs are also too small for the body up here. This could be straightened out more. And the head is too far in front of the arm, there should be more overlap within that. And the flexing direction, this is a little bit more in a straight line through here. There's a slight flexion here, and you can make that much straighter. The flexion is in the wrong direction on this one. And then you're trying to shoot for muscles here when there shouldn't be any muscles. Don't need a navel either. This is too small and this is too small in relationship to the body. But you have the right idea as far as making these narrower. It's just proportionately speaking, they're too small, especially the hands compared to the rest of it. And as far as the floor planes go, you only need to chase directly below the width of the figure. That's all you really need. If you can reduce that floor plane down, it's going to be a lot easier to capture. And then finally, I think this one also was sort of not necessarily, well, there are part skeletons in these. Now, the problem here is there's two things here. There's no floor plane and horizon line, so the perspective hasn't been found correctly with the figures yet. But also, you're chasing too many things here. Muscle rhythms, bones, and then a lack of joints. This is like that old school animation kind of drawing where you still have to fill in those gaps. And we can't judge proportion when there's a space missing between the joints. When a leg is straight, it just makes sense to shoot from top to bottom in one long continuous line rather than breaking it up into segments. But also, they don't need missing joints. And for anybody learning the figure, try to avoid ball joints and try to avoid missing joints. Both of those together equal, you still have another extra step to go through to solve the problems of what's missing in either of those instances. It just makes sense when the legs and the arms are bent, let the lines cross through each other. When the legs and the arms are straight, draw straight through from hip to foot, and you'll have a much easier time putting everything else together afterwards. This is also broken. And this is chasing too many corners too quickly instead of just trying to determine what the flow is of the figure. You can't see that because I'm drawing over a dark line there, but this would be the back. All right, everyone. Thank you very much again for bringing in your drawings for review. I really appreciate this, and I look forward to doing more of these again in the future. When you're out on location, it's a little bit different than if you're drawing in a classroom or if you're, of course, drawing from a photograph. Photographs don't move. Classroom setting, the model will take a pose and hold it for X amount of hours or minutes or whatever the time duration is. And that allows you to work on the pose, build it up, develop it, render it, and do whatever it is that particular pose is allotted. If you're doing a figure drawing, you can render it all the way through. If you're doing quick sketches, you're quickly designing the action and you're trying to get it to look as dimensionally realistic as possible. When you're out on location, everything is different. You're chasing movement because nobody is holding a pose for you. So I'm out on location at a sports park. I'm really lucky to have several of these around my house, so I can go to different parks where there's different sports. This one in particular has a swimming pool, basketball courts, soccer, rugby, a skate park. It has a lot. And so I can go sit in different locations and hope I don't look suspect. Today, I didn't really look all that suspect. I was sitting over on a picnic bench, just kind of taking it all in. Except that I have a tripod sitting over an art pad and I'm looking down on the art pad, which is usually something that people pick up on pretty quickly. I'm glad that they didn't. I'm actually fairly far away from everybody that I was drawing. Sometimes somebody would ride up, like this scooter kid rode up really close to me and then sat there and called his friend or his mom, or I don't remember exactly who it was he was calling, but he was yelling across the field, paying no attention to me at all. He was looking the other way. So it was easy for me to capture this. Of course, it's his backside, but it's still fairly close, where everybody else is a good distance away, at least 100 yards or even more. On this day also, there was somebody that got hurt at the swimming pool and an EMT truck drove up with another fire truck, and there was like 15 fire dudes, but I didn't want to draw that either because that's, it's kind of a bad thing. So I don't want to sit there and gawk over it and sketch things. Although when they were finally finished and they were all sitting around meeting with each other, that's when I drew one of them. On this day, I spent maybe 45 minutes at most out at the park, and I drew probably 20 quick sketches, which I'll post at the very end of this. If you're on my Patreon site, I'm going to post all these videos up. I have at least triple the number of videos of me sketching, and I'll go over each one of them more thoroughly on the Patreon site. Now, the thing that you want to remember here, there's a couple things that are really important. The first is you have to memorize. You have to look at the model or whoever is your model, and you have to memorize what they're doing. So take in the pose, take in a memorable pose or a moment in time that you're like, oh, that looks pretty cool. I want to draw that particular pose. Commit it to memory, continue committing it to memory, and then draw it. The other thing you want to remember is that the armature is your friend, but you don't have to be perfect with it. In fact, you don't have time to be perfect with it. You're developing a sort of shorthand when you're doing these. So you're getting the looseness of the pose. You have to be willing to forego perfection for getting the pose correct. I'm not thinking about how perfect these things are. I'm thinking about trying to capture the gesture before the person leaves or before the memory fades. So the first thing again is to memorize the pose. Then the next thing is have a relaxed hand and be okay with lines that aren't clean, shapes that aren't perfect, and very quickly draw out the pose instantly, the quick armature, pillow shape, and the limbs. Add the details later. Notice how I'm holding the pencil on the side? If I hold this thing like I'm writing, I'm doomed because I'm going to be drawing one little bit at a time. There isn't going to be this perfect drawing, and I'm not going to be able to make every line clean. But what I can do is I can sketch quick. I have the lead drawn out pretty big so that I can cover the tones very fast. And I'm not thinking about little nuances like pockets and stripes on a shirt or anything of that sort. I'm quickly drawing out the gesture. From head to toe, I'm taking in the information. The thing about a lot of these poses is that there are people standing around most of the time. There's not a lot of action taking place. It's just mostly people standing there, looking out across the park, looking at a friend, talking on a phone, walking a dog, looking for children. It's just mostly people standing, which is actually easy to do. Whereas if I'm out in a construction zone or if I'm actually drawing athletes at work, then it's a little more difficult and you have to snapshot in your mind the pose, which is also not a difficult thing. There's a certain, well, let's just say that when somebody's just standing there, it's a golden opportunity to learn how to do this. Now, remember again that you're gesturing out the figure as fast as possible from head to toe. You're not looking at the little details. You're taking in the entire impressionable pose. And then you put in the details. The details come later. You're not starting with the details, though. If you start with the details, again, you're going to back yourself into a really bad corner that you won't be able to figure out what to put down next. You'll forget the person, the way they looked, their action. You'll start forgetting things pretty quickly if you put one little bit down at a time. The other thing you want to take into consideration is rhythm and movement. How do you create movement in the pose? How do you create flow? It's not about mechanical perfection. It's about flow. It's about capturing somebody in their essence of what they're doing, trying to capture the personality, trying to capture the demeanor of the person, trying to capture the moment. And then the rest of it is building off of memory. Now you'll see these drawings change as they go. Details will come in, details will move, shapes will change, shapes will grow, they'll shrink, they'll become more dynamic, They'll become even looser, not stiffer, because I'm not looking for stiffness. I'm looking for the flow. I'm looking for top to bottom flow. I'm also not trying to be clean about anything, especially knowing that those people could easily come over and look at what I'm doing. I don't want to get bogged down in things. I want to be able to act and react quickly when I'm drawing, especially if they are going to come over and look at the drawing. I want to make sure that there's something there that captures who they are in a healthy way, in a positive way, not something insulting, not something demeaning, but something interesting, like something that would actually interest them too if they saw that I was drawing them. Oh, that's me. Yeah, that is you. And I've had people come over and look at what I'm doing. I've had people come over insulted. I've had people come over with interest. It varies. But you also have to be okay with that. You have to be okay with somebody coming over and asking you what you're doing. And then be honest, be straight up honest. Yeah, I'm an artist and I've got an illustration that I'm doing with a bunch of people that need to be in the background. And I came out here to capture people doing what they do because I need people for my background. You just happen to be walking along in such a way that it was like, oh, that's really interesting. I want to capture that. And then they start asking questions. They're curious and then they walk away. Rarely is it that they're going to say, throw that away. I don't want to be in a picture. They're more baffled than they are upset. And you have to be okay with talking to people. You can't be nervous about it. You can't be mean. You just have to kind of go with the flow. I really enjoy being out on location. I think it's a lot of fun. It's very, very challenging, but it's putting all the skills to test. And again, it's not about clean and perfect. It's about a shorthand, looking for the rhythm and the flow, memorizing the pose, memorizing the details that go with the pose, but not putting the details in the forefront, not getting caught up in the nuances of musculature or if a joint is correctly connected to the body. Those things will eventually arrive at the correct conclusion if you know something is drawn incorrectly. But to get something down on paper really quickly is not an easy task, and that's what you're actually practicing. That's what you're trying to learn how to do. React and not get caught up in perfect. Now, this is one of the most challenging things to do as an artist. You can go out on location with a still life or a landscape. They're not going to move. The light is going to move, but the objects themselves are not. But going out and capturing people in the wild is a very big challenge. It's the same thing with going out and drawing animals. They're either totally chill and sitting most of the time, or they're constantly moving. This is all about memory. And the one thing you have to remember is that all drawing is memory drawing. There isn't really ever a moment when you're looking at the subject and drawing the subject identical at the same time and seeing both of them at the same time. It just doesn't work that way. You look up, you take it in, and then you start drawing. So again, I want to preface this. Flow and rhythm. You've learned this armature, or you're learning this armature so that it becomes a tool for you on location or for whatever purpose you want to put it to use with. You spend a lot of time with it to try and perfect it so that when you do go out on location, you have a shorthand that you can rely upon and you can lean into, and it will help you make better choices in your drawing. The more you practice with it, the less you're going to struggle with it. The more you practice with it, the less you have to think about it. And you have more memory space to take in what it is that you're seeing. Memory sketching is an exercise in itself, and I'll definitely do a video on it because I think everybody needs to eventually get to that point where memory sketching is a thing that they do, that you do. And I would want you to. I would want you to practice memory sketching. If you rely completely on photographic reference, your illustrations are going to look like photographic reference. When you start working with your memory, the photo goes away and actually becomes part of the illustration. You're memorizing something to put it into a situation, whether it's a fantasy situation or science fiction situation or a real world fantastical situation. Real world fantastical just meaning that you're generating something that fits into our timeline, but maybe didn't actually happen. It's something that you're fantasizing for the sake of storytelling. But all of it is memory. All of it is. The rhythm and the flow has to do with capturing the pose from head to toe. People move. Their bodies are fluid. And that's what you're capturing. If you draw part by part by part, there's no flow to that. But that's what you work out of your system when you study things like the armature and study from photo reference. You're practicing something repeatedly so that it becomes second nature to you as a baseline of skills that allows you to do things like this. Now, you don't need to know the armature to go out and do this kind of sketching, but the armature certainly helps because it's a wonderful, simple template that fits anybody. Remember, muscles and body fat sit on top of the skeleton, and the armature is the skeleton. If you can get the armature working, then you can capture any type of body, any human body with different musculature, different weight, different height, and then eventually different actions. You practice foreshortening so you can capture more dynamic actions or actions that are really difficult to capture. The other thing you need is a tool that helps you flow. The pen that I used in the first sketch in the last video, this pencil, or any other tool that flows, that allows you to achieve that fluid rhythm, is what you're looking for. You're looking for something that feels buttery. Between that buttery tool and your ability to see rhythm, it shouldn't be that difficult to quickly gesture something out. And again, it's not about capturing the likeness instantly. It's about capturing the action. If you've memorized everything, you should be able to find the likeness too. The details that attribute to likeness are secondhand. The action is primary. Now with clothing, you don't have time to work out the folds. You don't have time to work out the stripes. At least up front you don't. The patterns and things of that sort. Those come later. If you've memorized the information, then you're learning how to memorize in a hierarchy of information. First is the gesture. Second is the type. Third are the nuances, the clothing details, the facial hair details, the type of sunglasses, and so forth. Those come later. And you can get those wrong, but still get it right. As long as you have glasses on the person who was wearing glasses, it's not going to look wrong. You're not out there trying to get a perfect rendition, a perfect likeness. You're looking for a character type. So it doesn't matter if the type is off a little bit. You've still captured something that's useful for your needs. So again, if you're on my Patreon, you'll see these videos at length, many of them, and I'll be covering what I did with each one of them very specifically. This is more of a general overview and insight into how to do it. Now, hopefully in the future, some of you will post your drawings, your sketches that you've been doing out on location. I'd love to see them. And I'm more than happy to critique them if you're looking for a critique as well. All right. Hopefully I'll see some of you out there on the field. Have fun doing it. Don't get freaked out about it. Don't get nervous. Relax when you do this. Learn how to work with your memory. Because again, almost everything we do as an artist, in fact, everything we do as an artist, comes from memorization. Well, we're at the end of another one, and I hope you gained something from this video. Thank you for following along and making it all the way through. Now, I know one video or several is not an education at all. It's just a primer for where you would like to go next. The real training comes with somebody that you can learn from, whether it's in a class or a mentorship. Either way, having somebody there to give you feedback, demonstrate, and show you what to do so that you can then take that work to make more improvements is the way that you're going to learn realism that much quicker. Realism is kind of a tricky thing because you have to learn all these different steps and tools, and it feels like it's going to take forever to do. And in some cases, if you don't have a lot of time, it might feel that way for sure. While many think that self-education is the way to go for art, it actually isn't. You really do need somebody there to show you why you're doing things the way you're doing it, and when you do something wrong, how to correct it. That's absolutely vital. The wisdom and experience from someone who already knows is more valuable than a book and video for training. They don't give you feedback, they just give you stuff to work with. You still have to know if you're doing it right or not. And that, again, is where that one-on-one experience really, really helps. Speaking for myself, I have a mentorship program with many different tiers, affordable tiers, that you can definitely work with. I also have a Patreon page with tiers on there. Some of those tiers have one-on-one interaction, and some of them have critique interaction. Then there's the Discord page, where I do give some feedback and advice to the people who are there training. Although it isn't an actual mentorship, it's still interaction, and it can help you move forward. In the next episode, we're going to look at putting tones over the figure, covering those muscles up and starting with local values. The video following is going to be shading and rendering to bring the figure to completion. And I really look forward to sharing this information with you. So once again, thank you very much. Like, subscribe, and share the video with others. Keep your focus, stay creative, and I'll see you in the next one.